The turkey wasn't even carved yet when my brother raised his glass and told the whole table that our grandfather's workshop had sold. "Closed escrow last Tuesday," he said, grinning at me over the candles. "Cash offer, no contingencies. Guess Grandpa knew who to trust with the real decisions." My mother laughed into her napkin and added, "You were never going to get it anyway, honey. Let's not pretend otherwise on Thanksgiving." 9 people turned to watch my face. I kept eating my potatoes. None of them knew the deed to that workshop already had a name typed on it, sitting in a manila envelope in the trunk of my car. And in about 90 seconds, that name was going to turn their little celebration into the quietest room in 3 counties. Welcome back to Quiet Justice Stories, where ordinary people meet families who underestimate them and answer not with shouting, but with paperwork. If you've ever wanted to stand up at a table and set something down instead of raising your voice, you're going to like this one. I'm going to tell you how I got to that Thanksgiving table with a folder that ended my family's 15-minute celebration. But first, you need to understand how I got there, and it started almost 14 months earlier on an ordinary Sunday with a phone call I almost didn't answer. My name doesn't matter as much as my grandfather's did, so I'll just tell you I'm 37. I restore vintage furniture and small engines for a living, and I grew up in a family that measured love in square footage and resale value. My grandfather, Elmer Voss, built cabinets and repaired outboard motors out of a converted barn behind his house in upstate New York for 51 years. Everyone in 3 townships called it the workshop, capital W, like it was a landmark because it was. I was the only grandchild who ever wanted to be out there with him. My brother Derek wanted the Xbox and later the car keys. My cousin Amy wanted nothing to do with sawdust. But from the time I was 9, I was the one riding my bike over after school to sweep shavings and hand Grandpa Elmer wrenches while he cursed softly at a carburetor that wouldn't cooperate. He taught me to read a torque spec, the way other kids learned multiplication tables. "A machine doesn't lie to you," he used to say. "People do that. A machine just tells you exactly what's wrong if you're patient enough to listen." That workshop is where I learned the trade that pays my bills today. When I opened my own restoration business at 24, in a rented garage bay 2 towns over, my mother called it a hobby with a business license. My grandfather drove 40 minutes with a truck bed full of his old clamps and said, "Every good shop needs proper clamps. Yours didn't have any." For the last 9 years of his life, as his hips gave out and his hands started to shake on cold mornings, I was the one who drove over every weekend. I mowed around the workshop, changed the furnace filter in the main house, drove him to cardiology appointments in Albany, and sat with him on Sunday afternoons listening to the same 3 stories about the Korean War he'd told 100 times before. My mother visited on birthdays. Derek visited when he needed to borrow the truck. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because of something my grandfather said to me the last good summer we had, standing in the workshop doorway, watching the sun go down over the tree line. "This place goes to the one who actually shows up," he said, out of nowhere, like he was commenting on the weather. I laughed it off, told him he had plenty of years left, don't talk that way. He just smiled the small, private smile he got when he'd already made up his mind about something and went back inside to close up the shop for the night. I should have asked him what he meant by that. I didn't. I thought there was time. He passed in his sleep that November, 4 days after handing me a small brass key for safekeeping that I assumed was a spare to the workshop's side door. I didn't think much of it. I was wrong about a lot of things that year, and I wouldn't understand any of it until the shop had already gone up for sale out from under me. The funeral was the kind of gray, damp affair upstate winters specialize in. I planned almost all of it, the hymns he liked, the flowers, the obituary that actually mentioned the Korean War stories instead of just beloved father and grandfather. My mother, Carol, wore a black coat that still had the tags tucked into the sleeve and accepted condolences like she was collecting them. Derek spent most of the reception on his phone, occasionally looking up to mention, unprompted, that the workshop property had to be worth something with that road frontage. Nobody asked what would happen to Grandpa's dog. Nobody asked who'd finish the rocking chair he'd left half-sanded on the bench. They asked what the acreage would fetch. 3 weeks later, my Uncle Ron, Mom's brother, a man who does consulting and has never held one job longer than 18 months, called a family meeting to go over the will. It wasn't at an attorney's office. It was at my mother's dining room table, with a store-bought pie and a manila folder Ron had clearly printed at a copy shop that morning. Ron put on a pair of drugstore reading glasses he didn't need and announced that Grandpa Elmer had left the house, the workshop, and the 5 acres it sat on to my mother, in recognition of her lifelong devotion and care, the document said. My mother pressed a tissue to the corner of one dry eye. Derek squeezed her shoulder. My name did not appear anywhere in the will. Not as a beneficiary. Not as a witness. Not in a footnote about the tools, which everyone in that family knew were the only thing I'd ever actually asked for. You were never really going to be in it, sweetheart, my mother said, refolding the tissue she hadn't used. There was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth when she said it, and something in my stomach went cold. I sat very still. I'm good at that. But inside, 2 things were doing math at once. The first, lifelong devotion and care, was a phrase my grandfather would rather have eaten his own hammer than write about my mother, who he once described, fondly and accurately, as allergic to a toolbox. The second, the signature. I had watched Elmer Voss sign work orders, tax forms, and Christmas cards my entire life. This signature was too even, too confident. The signature of a man who could still hold a pen steady. The Elmer I'd sat with in his final weeks could barely grip a coffee cup without both hands. And the date typed at the bottom of the document was 11 days before he died. 11 days. I didn't say any of this out loud at the table. I thanked Ron for his time, ate a slice of pie I couldn't taste, and drove home with my hands steady on the wheel, and my mind doing arithmetic the whole way. Here's the thing about restoring old machines for a living. You learn to notice what's missing before you notice what's there. A gap in a serial number, a part that's been swapped for a cheaper substitute and painted to match. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table and laid the whole thing out like a repair log. 2 years before he died, Grandpa Elmer had asked me to drive him into Albany to get some paperwork settled. He made me wait in the car, which was very like him, and came out an hour later with a sealed envelope and a lawyer's business card he tucked into his shirt pocket. I'd never seen the documents, but I knew they existed. So how did a will drafted by a real estate attorney 2 years earlier become a will notarized by my Uncle Ron, 11 days before Grandpa's death, when Grandpa hadn't left the property in 4 months and hadn't been well enough to travel anywhere, let alone to whatever office Ron claimed to have visited? I called Ron the next morning and asked plainly when exactly Dad, he always called Grandpa Dad to sound official, had signed this new version. He got vague fast. He had me come out to the house, Ron said. Change of heart at the end. Happens all the time. I asked who witnessed it. He said he'd have to check his files. A notary who has to check whether anyone witnessed a will is a notary telling you something without meaning to. Before I called a lawyer, I did the reasonable thing and asked my own family for the truth. I drove to my mother's house and asked to see the actual probate filing, the real one, not Ron's copy shop folder. Her whole face changed. Why on earth would you need that? She asked. I keep books for a living, I told her. Reading paperwork is what I do. That's when she reached for the tool she'd used on me my whole life, turning herself into the victim. I cannot believe you, she said, voice wobbling on cue. Your grandfather is barely cold and you're already fighting about money. Derek appeared in the doorway right on schedule. Don't make this ugly. It's so like you to make everything about you. My father, who has said maybe 400 words to me in my adult life, studied his shoes. I looked at the 3 of them and understood something I should have understood years earlier. They weren't confused, and they weren't grieving strangely. They had a plan, and the plan required me quiet, ashamed, and gone. So I went quiet. Not the way they wanted. I found the attorney whose card Grandpa had tucked into his pocket 2 years earlier. I'd filed it in my desk without a second thought, the way you do with things you can't quite throw away. Her name was Diane Okafor, and her assistant put me through to her the moment I mentioned my grandfather's name, which told me something before Diane even picked up. Diane was careful on the phone, the way good attorneys are, and asked me to come in with identification. In the meantime, I learned that the estate was already moving fast. Too fast. My mother had filed for an informal, uncontested probate, the kind that sails through when nobody objects. The court doesn't test a signature unless an heir contests it, and no heir had. The legal notice had gone to an old address of mine, arriving well after the window to easily object had nearly closed. Diane's office had never been notified, because nobody's obligated to tell the attorney who drafted an earlier will that a newer one has surfaced, and there was already a listing. The workshop and the 5 acres were going up for sale, not quietly to some prearranged buyer, but through a public estate auction, the fastest legal route to cash when an estate needs to settle debts, and a shaky will needs to avoid scrutiny. Public. Open to anyone with financing and the nerve to show up. My mother had no idea that meant me, too. Diane Okafor's office smelled like coffee and old case files. She was a compact woman in her 60s with a handshake that meant it. I put my license on her desk. She looked at it, then at me, and her shoulders eased slightly. "You have his jaw," she said, and opened a file 2 inches thick. 2 years earlier, she told me, my grandfather had come in clear-headed and deliberate. He'd drafted a will, properly signed, properly witnessed by 2 of her staff, properly notarized. In it, he left the house, the workshop, and the 5 acres to me. The one who actually shows up, the document read, almost word for word what he'd told me on the porch that last summer. I had to look at the window for a moment. I told Diane about Ron's version, the 2 steady signature, the 11 days before death date, the copy shop folder at the dining room table. Her expression went flat and professional, which is how good attorneys look when they're furious. "I drafted the operative will," she said. "Nobody ever contacted me about a revocation. A later will can override an earlier one, but only if it's valid. If what you're describing is what I think it is, everything filed under it is challengeable." I asked where the original signed copy was. Diane had a conformed copy in her file, but Grandpa had insisted on keeping the executed original himself, in a place, she said, he was very specific about and very proud of. That night, I went back to Grandpa's house one last time, before the estate sale company changed the locks. I still had the brass key he'd pressed into my hand 4 days before he died. The one I'd assumed was a spare for the side door. It wasn't. It was the key to his old steel toolbox, the one that had sat under his workbench my entire life, the one I'd never once seen him open in front of anyone. Inside, tucked beneath a tray of socket wrenches, I found 2 things. The first was a small manila envelope marked, in his blocky handwriting, Fidelity Trust, Box 212. The second was a sealed letter with my name on the front. My hands, which never shake, shook. I knew what the safe deposit key meant. I wasn't ready yet for the letter. So I carried it around, unopened, for 4 days, because some truths, once you let them out, don't fold back up, and I wanted to be strong enough to act on whatever it said before I read it. While I worked up the nerve to open that letter, I built the thing that would let me fight. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I just needed to bid on that property without my family seeing my name and jacking the price up out of spite the second they recognized it. So, I formed a limited liability company, Voss Bench Holdings, LLC, the same way thousands of ordinary buyers do it every year, entirely above board. Public records would only ever show the company name. I reported myself as the true owner to the Federal Registry, privately, because I do everything by the book, even when the people around me clearly don't. Then came the money. The property had been appraised around $260,000, not a fortune in a big city, but a mountain when you run a small furniture restoration shop. I'd been careful for over a decade, though. I had savings I'd built specifically for a future workshop expansion. I had a small inheritance from my other grandmother that I'd never touched, because Elmer had once told me, save that for something that matters. And I qualified for a commercial mortgage in the company's name to cover the rest. I stress tested the numbers for 2 nights straight, the way I'd never let a client of mine overextend. It was tight, but it was clean. And I had one thing working in my favor. My mother needed cash fast, which meant she'd set the auction reserve low to guarantee a quick sale. A low reserve is a door left open. I intended to walk through it. Right in the middle of my planning, Derek called to share some good news. He'd put a deposit on a brand new pickup truck, the loaded trim, heated everything, paid for, he explained, out of his share of the estate money that hadn't even cleared probate yet. I asked mildly whether that was wise before the sale actually closed. "Oh, come on," he said, breezy as anything. "If Grandpa had left it to you, you'd have just let the shop rot anyway. At least Mom will actually sell it to someone who will use the land, right?" There it was, the family sentence, worn smooth from repeated use, now aimed at me from a slightly different angle. As if 9 years of Sunday afternoons and cardiology waiting rooms were the thing that would have gone to waste. I felt the old urge to list every appointment, every oil change, every hour of sweeping sawdust to make him understand. I didn't. I'd finally learned you don't explain your worth to people who've already decided you don't have any. "We'll see," I said, and let it go quiet on the line until he changed the subject to towing capacity. The night before I met Diane to plan the safe deposit box, I finally opened my grandfather's letter. I made coffee, I didn't drink, and sat in his old shop chair. I'd taken it home the week after the funeral and slid my thumb under the seal. His handwriting filled 2 pages, blunt and unadorned, exactly like his voice. He wrote that he'd known for years what was coming. He knew about Ron's money troubles and the favor Ron had clearly been promised. He knew my mother had never once, not once, asked him a question about the shop that wasn't really a question about its resale value. "I've watched this coming for a long time," he wrote. "Your mother loves money the way some men love a bottle, and she'll tell herself any story that gets her more of it." Then he told me what he'd done, the real will, filed properly, witnessed, and notarized, sitting in a safe deposit box with my name already added as a co-signer so it would never freeze when he died. And then the line I've read so many times, I could recite it in my sleep. "If anybody ever tells you that you were never in my will, you set this letter down on the table in front of them and you let the paper do the talking. Don't fight them with your voice, kid. You were never much good at that, and it was never your strength anyway. Steady hands are your strength. That shop goes to the one who showed up. That's you. It was always going to be you." I sat there a long time. Then it came. Not the tidy way people cry in movies, but the ragged kind that shows up when someone reaches past their own death and tells you they saw you the whole time. 2 days later, Diane and I opened safe deposit box 212 at Fidelity Trust. Grandpa had thought of everything. He'd quietly added me as a co-signer years earlier, so the box never froze with the estate and I didn't need a court order to open it. Inside was a slim folder holding the executed original of his real will. Signatures and notary seal intact, dated 2 years back. Diane laid it beside a copy of Ron's version on her conference table and put her glasses on. She pointed out the mismatched witness names, 2 people it turned out, who no longer even lived in the county, and the signature itself, which she called a careful copy by someone who'd clearly seen the real thing too many times. "Genuine signatures from a dying man wobble," she told me. This one marched in a straight, confident line. "We can file to reopen probate and allege fraud," she said. "If the court agrees everything done under the false will becomes challengeable. But that process is slow, months, maybe longer, especially if your family fights it. And in the meantime, the auction goes forward as scheduled. The shop sells. So we fight it on 2 fronts," I said. She took off her glasses and looked at me for a long moment. "Your grandfather," she said, "would have liked that very much." Then she picked up her pen and we got to work, form the company, bid clean at auction, and pursue the fraud case afterward to make the truth land exactly where it belonged. The auction was held on a cold March morning in a county building with folding chairs and burnt coffee. I didn't go in, that was the whole point. I sent a calm paralegal from Diane's office to bid on behalf of Voss Bench Holdings with my hard limit written on an index card in his coat pocket, while I sat in my truck in the parking lot with my heart in my throat. My mother and Derek went in dressed like they were headed to a party. Bidding opened low, exactly as I'd predicted, and climbed steadily, a local contractor eyeing the road frontage, an investor from Albany, and the quiet man in a gray coat who kept nodding and raising the company's number, patient as a Tuesday. It crossed 240,000. My family, I learned later, was thrilled. Every raise meant more cash in their pockets, and they had no idea who was driving it, or why. At 271,000, the room went still. The gavel came down and the workshop belonged to Voss Bench Holdings, LLC. My phone buzzed. Sold to your company. Congratulations. I sat in that cold truck and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. My mother walked out a few minutes later, glowing, already talking about that aggressive little company that had bid them up nicely. She passed within 20 feet of my truck and never once looked over. She thought she'd sold her father-in-law's shop to a stranger for top dollar. She had no idea she'd sold it back to the daughter she'd sworn was never in the will. The money moved the way money moves when people are desperate to spend it. My mother took the largest share, most of which went straight toward a second mortgage she'd been hiding from my father for years. Derek finished paying off his new truck. My father took whatever was handed to him and said, "Thank you" to no one. I sat in my own shop the night the funds cleared, laid the new deed under the workbench lamp, and traced the address with one finger. Voss Bench Holdings, LLC, owner of record. My grandfather's shop, back where it belonged, and not one of them knew. I didn't feel triumphant that night. I felt tired and sad, and a strange tenderness for the man who'd armed me for this from beyond the grave. The triumph, I understood, would come later. Word around town moves fast when a beloved local landmark changes hands. At the hardware store, the real one, downtown, not Grandpa's shop, old Mr. Halloran, who'd fished with Elmer for 30 years, stopped me by the fasteners aisle. "Heard whoever bought Voss's place means to keep the shop running," he said. "That true?" Someone at the title company must have talked. I told him it was true. His eyes went bright. "Good," he said. That man loved that barn more than most people love their own kids. Then he went back to his shopping, and I stood there a moment, understanding all over again why I'd drained my savings and mortgaged my future for a pile of lumber and old tools. Not to punish anyone, to keep a promise. Meanwhile, word started reaching Ron that a company had requested the full probate file from the county, including the will he'd notarized. To a man who'd been paid to look the other way, that's the sound of a floor creaking in a house he thought was empty. I happened to be dropping off a pie at my mother's a few days before Thanksgiving when I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, voice low and sharp. "Stop calling here. Nobody's investigating anything. You did your part, you got paid. Now act normal." A pause. "Because if you fall apart, Ron, you take all of us down with you. You got paid. A notary doesn't get a special fee for honest work. The price list is posted on the wall." I filed that sentence away and kept my pleasant face on the whole drive home. The invitation to Thanksgiving came in early November, and it surprised me. My mother called, sugar sweet, insisting I come home and put all this nonsense behind us. I could hear two things underneath her cheerful voice. The first was theater. Nothing says we've moved on, nothing to see here, like the difficult daughter back at the table. The second was nerves. Word around the county about some company asking questions had reached her, and she wanted to make sure I wasn't stirring a pot that might splash on her. "And let's not have any drama about the shop this year," she added, because she couldn't help herself. "You know you were never really going to get it. No need to make everyone uncomfortable over it." I looked out my shop window at the Christmas lights already going up on Main Street and thought about Diane's fraud petition, drafted and ready to file the week after the holiday. I thought about the deed in my desk drawer and the letter in my truck's glove box. "I'll be there," I said. "What can I bring?" "Just yourself," she said. I brought myself. I also brought a slim leather folder tucked in my bag, right next to the cranberry sauce. I'd wrestled with the timing for a week. Part of me, the quiet part my grandfather understood so well, wanted to let the lawsuit land privately in January. No audience, no scene. It felt more dignified. But another truth sat right alongside it. They'd made me small in front of a crowd, at the will reading, at the funeral, at every family gathering for over a year because a smirk only works when other people are watching it land. Maybe the truth deserved the same room the lie had used. I pulled out Grandpa's letter one more time. Let the paper do the talking. There was my answer in his handwriting. No shouting, no wine glasses thrown, just 3 documents laid out in order, the way you'd lay out a repair log for a customer who insists nothing's wrong with their engine. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon. My mother had gone all out, The good china, candles, a centerpiece she'd clearly bought that morning. My father sat at the foot of the table, silent as furniture. Derek and his girlfriend were already 2 glasses of wine in. Uncle Ron sat near the end, closest to the door, sweating slightly in a sweater 2 sizes too warm for the room. My mother seated me on her right, the place of honor, so everyone could see how gracious she was being to her difficult daughter. I let her. I complimented the centerpiece. I passed the rolls. I asked Derek's girlfriend about her job. By every outward measure, I was a perfectly pleasant guest. Inside, I was as still as I've ever been. Between the main course and the pie, my mother tapped her wine glass with a fork and stood up for her announcement. "I just want to say," she began, hand pressed to her chest, "what a hard year it's been, losing Dad. But we got through it as a family, and I'm happy to tell everyone that we finally closed on the workshop last week." She raised her glass. "It's done. We can all move forward." Glasses lifted around the table. Derek said, "Cheers, Mom." Then her eyes slid to me and the smirk came out, the one that needed an audience to work. "I know it's been a sore spot for some," she said, swirling her wine, looking right at me. "But honestly, sweetheart, you were never going to get it anyway. There's no shame in that. Dad just knew who'd handle things responsibly." A few uncomfortable chuckles around the table. Derek's girlfriend studied her plate. My father went very still. I set down my fork. "Not yet." Derek, who never could stand a silence, filled it for her. "Don't feel bad," he said, lifting his own glass toward me like a favor. "Honestly, it's for the best. You'd have just let the place fall apart anyway." There it was. The second knife, the matching one, delivered with a smile between the turkey and the pie. Ron reached for his water glass and missed it on the first try. And I sat there in the place of honor and felt the last hesitation leave my body. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and set it beside my plate. Slow, deliberate, the way Grandpa used to when he'd decided a conversation was finished. Then I took one unhurried sip of wine while the whole table watched, set the glass down, and asked, in the same pleasant voice I'd used about the rolls, "Can I ask who you actually sold it to?" My mother blinked, thrown by how calm I sounded. "What?" "The shop. Who bought it?" She recovered fast because she loved telling this part. "Some company, Voss Bench Holdings, I think. An investment group. Bid us up nicely, actually. Paid well over what we expected." She smiled around the table, gathering her admiration. "Voss Bench Holdings," I repeated, like I was double-checking. "That's right." "Why?" I reached into my bag and my hand closed around the leather folder. I brought it up and set it on the white tablecloth. 11 pairs of eyes followed it. "This is the deed to Grandpa's shop," I said, laying the first page in the center of the table. "Recorded the day of the auction." My mother glanced down, impatient, then her eyes caught the owner's name and stopped moving entirely. "Voss Bench Holdings, LLC. "I don't understand," she said, and her voice had already changed shape. I set down the second page. "This is Grandpa's real will, drafted 2 years ago by his actual attorney, properly signed and witnessed. It leaves the shop and the property to me. By name." The color left her face the way water leaves a tub, all at once, straight down the drain. Derek leaned in to read and went quiet. Ron pushed his chair back an inch, like the floor had actually started creaking. I took out the third page last because you saved the heart for the end. "And this," I said, "is the letter he left me. The one that told me exactly what all of you would do." The table had gone so quiet I could hear the candles. I folded my hands and let everyone look. My mother found her voice first, and it came out loud and scrambling, the way I knew it would. "That's a lie," she said, half rising, her wine glass tipping and bleeding red across the white cloth. "Ron, tell her that will isn't real." But Ron was already standing, gray as ash, muttering something about needing air, backing toward the coat closet like a man late for a train. I didn't raise my voice. I put one hand flat on my grandfather's letter and looked at my mother across the ruined tablecloth. "You said I was never going to get it," I said. "You were right. The one I was in. Ron replaced it. I have the original." Nobody moved. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer went off, cheerful and completely absurd, for a pie nobody got up to answer. I looked at Derek, who'd laughed about me letting the place fall apart, and gave him the only answer that mattered. Turns out I didn't waste it, I said quietly. I bought back the only thing in this family that was ever actually worth keeping. I didn't stay for pie. I gathered the 3 pages back into their folder, thanked my mother for dinner with a courtesy that landed harder than any insult could have, and drove home through the same Christmas lights I'd been staring at for a month. The rest happened faster than expected, because a lie cracks quickest once everyone in the room can see the seam. Diane filed the petition the first business day after the holiday. We presented the original will and the evidence of the forgery, and the court took it seriously. Ron's notary commission came under review within weeks, and once he understood what losing his license would actually cost him, he stopped pretending anything about that document had been proper. With the fraudulent will discredited, the court reopened the estate under Grandpa's real will, the one that left the property to me. My purchase at the public auction stood on its own. I'd bought it at arm's length, at market price in good faith, and a court won't unwind a clean sale like that. What got unwound was the money. The cash my family had already spent came out of an estate emptied under a forged document, and the court ordered it repaid. Money my mother had already sunk into a mortgage she'd hidden for years. Money Derek had already put into a truck he had to sell to cover his share of the debt. I took no joy in that part, and I want you to believe that. But I took no responsibility for it either, because I never forged a single signature, and I never reached for $1 that wasn't mine. As for the workshop, I kept it 2 ways at once. The auction had made me the legal owner. The real will had made me the rightful heir. 2 different roads, the same barn door. That spring I drove out, oiled the hinges on that side door, and finished sanding the rocking chair he'd left half done on the bench. Mr. Halloran stopped by with a thermos of coffee and didn't say much, which was its own kind of blessing. I left the door open for my father once, on one condition. It's open, I told him, whenever you're ready to be honest about what you signed. He hasn't walked through it yet. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Either way, the lathe still runs, and the shop still smells like sawdust and machine oil, exactly the way it's supposed to. Here's what I learned, standing in that quiet barn that used to be his. Family can vote you out of the story all they want, but the people who actually show up are the ones who end up holding the deed, the name, and the truth in that order. That's where I'll leave it tonight. The toast, the smirk, 3 pieces of paper on a ruined Thanksgiving tablecloth. If you've ever been the one who showed up while everyone else circled back only to collect, this one was for you. Do one quiet thing this week. Go check the paperwork on the things that actually matter, the deeds, the wills, the promises made to you out loud, gently and early, long before you'd ever need to raise your voice over them. Comment the one who showed up if you made it to the end with me. And if this is your kind of story, subscribe to Quiet Justice Stories. There's always another family, another table, and another truth waiting to be set down.